I took my wife to the party, imagining it would be an ordinary night, one of those that, over time, would become just another memory among many others. But, when he turned his back for a moment, the unexpected happened. There they were, dancing together, as if the world around them simply didn't exist. She, with a look that I had never noticed, and he, with an intimacy that made me question everything I believed to be true. The ground seemed to open beneath my feet, and the air became difficult to breathe. The music, once a pleasant background, now sounded like a hammer in my head, marking the rhythm of a betrayal I never imagined possible. Their every movement was a knife that cut deep, revealing a wound I didn't know existed. Her smile, previously reserved for me, was now shared with him, a complete stranger to me, but, apparently, someone very familiar to her. Every step they took in the room seemed rehearsed, as if that dance was an ancient choreography, something they had done so many times in secret. In an instant, memories of our marriage, of the moments when I believed I was building something solid, flashed through my mind. How could I have been so blind? Everything I believed to be real, all the trust one placed in her, was now in question. That brief look between them, that subtle touch, contained a story that I didn't yet know, but that was already beginning to reveal itself, bringing to light dark secrets that she had kept so well. But what most gnawed at me inside, what made my mind spin in a spiral of despair, was the simple question, what else was hidden behind that dance? If she had been able to keep something so devastating a secret, what else didn't I know? What else had been just a facade? The night that was supposed to be a celebration turned into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. And as the two of them danced, each step drawing a new blow to my heart, I felt the truth was about to emerge, ready to destroy what little was left of my trust. And in that room, filled with laughter and music, I knew I was about to discover what, in fact, had led my wife to this moment. A bitter truth that, deep down, I feared facing. But at the same time, I could no longer ignore it. Chicago, a city where skyscrapers touch the sky and the lights never go out, hid secrets around every corner, in every shadow cast by streetlights. It was a night like any other on the social calendar of the local elite. The party took place in a sophisticated event hall, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and tables adorned with carefully chosen floral arrangements. The environment exuded wealth, power and, at the same time, a certain artificiality that only the rich seemed to master so well. Thomas Bennett, a successful and respected businessman, was accustomed to this type of environment. He was a familiar face among Chicago's powerful, someone whose polite smile and firm handshake masked a disciplined but solitary life. At 42 years old, Thomas was the example of what many wanted to be, successful, charismatic and, as everyone believed, happily married. Married to Emily for 10 years, he always saw her as the perfect woman to complement his life, beautiful, elegant, and able to move with grace among the city's most exclusive social circles. Emily, on the other hand, was the picture of the perfect wife. She was 35 years old, and her beauty was often compared to the movie stars of Hollywood's golden age. Her long brown hair fell in soft waves, and her blue eyes seemed to hide a world of emotions. But behind that impeccable smile, there was a complexity that few knew about. Emily knew how to enchant an entire room, how to make each person feel special in her presence. However, what Thomas and the others didn't realize was that behind every carefully chosen gesture and word, there was a woman carrying an invisible burden. The party that night was in celebration of the success of Thomas's new venture, and everyone who mattered in the town was in attendance. Emily was next to Thomas, smiling politely at the guests, exchanging kind words that dissipated into the air like the champagne in their glasses. For everyone present, they were the ideal couple, but for Emily, it was a golden prison. She had learned, over the years, to keep up appearances, to hide the discomfort she felt deep within her soul. Thomas, always so focused on his business, never realized that while he was building his empire, Emily felt increasingly distant from him and herself. While the guests chatted and laughed, Emily observed everything around her with calculated coolness. Every word she said was measured, every smile carefully controlled. But inside, she felt suffocated, as if she was being slowly erased. The wedding that was supposed to be a fairy tale had become a well-rehearsed farce. She didn't blame Thomas, he was exactly what he always was. The problem was, over the years, she had changed, and he never noticed. Among the guests, there was one man who stood out to Emily more than any other. Ethan Williams, a prestigious lawyer, was everything Thomas was not: adventurous, unpredictable, and passionate. Ethan and Emily met a few years ago at a charity event, and since then, there has been unresolved tension between them, something they both pretended didn't exist. But that night, as Thomas busied himself with business conversations, Emily and Ethan's eyes met across the room, and in that brief instant, something inside her awakened. Ethan was a charismatic man in his 40s with a natural charm that made people gravitate towards him. His dark hair and confident smile made him even more attractive, but it was the intensity in his eyes that really captured attention. He knew the power he had over Emily, and although they had never crossed the line of acceptable, there was something between them that neither time nor morality could dispel. The party continued, and Thomas, ever the diligent host, was busy ensuring that all the guests were well taken care of. He barely noticed when Emily and Ethan disappeared from the room, heading to one of the outside terraces. There, under the Chicago night sky, Emily finally let out some of the tension she was carrying. Ethan, noticing her condition, approached her cautiously, offering her a comfort she had never felt with Thomas. "Emily," he began, his voice low and filled with genuine concern. "You seem distant tonight." She looked up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the soft light of the stars, and for a moment, all she wanted was to be that woman Thomas believed her to be. But that woman no longer existed. "Ethan. Sometimes I feel like I'm living a life that isn't mine," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Ethan took a step closer, his presence comforting, and gently touched her arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Emily. I am here." Those words, simple and sincere, penetrated the barrier she had erected over the years. For the first time in a long time, she felt understood, and it terrified her as much as it comforted her. But before she could respond, the hall doors opened, and Thomas appeared, calling her back inside. He didn't notice the subtle exchange of glances between her and Ethan, nor the slight tremor in her voice when she responded. The party continued, but something had changed. An abyss opened between the expectations that everyone had and the reality that Emily was hiding. However, that night was just the beginning of a sequence of events that would change all three of their lives forever. For Thomas, there was still a certain innocence, a blind trust in the life he had built. For Emily, the night marked the beginning of a dark journey, where the masks she wore would begin to fall, revealing truths that even she herself tried to ignore. And for Ethan, that was a sign that the time to act was near. In the days following the party, Thomas's life continued to revolve around appointments and meetings, as if nothing had changed. He was a man of routines, someone who found comfort in the predictability of his schedule. But for Emily, every hour that passed brought with it a growing weight. The tension she had tried to ignore for years now hung over her head like a heavy cloud about to collapse. Thomas, as usual, left for the office early, immersing himself in piles of documents and negotiations that took him away from the world around him. He was a master at balancing multiple responsibilities, but ironically, he didn't realize that the balance in his marriage was about to crumble. Emily, on the other hand, found herself increasingly isolated in the vast house they shared. Every room seemed to echo the frustration and emptiness she felt but couldn't express. And Ethan? Well, he became a constant presence in her thoughts. The memories of that night on the terrace haunted her. Ethan's look, his words, the implicit promise that he could offer something Thomas never could, understanding. Emily's internal conflict grew every day, a silent struggle between loyalty and desire. But she knew that the choices she was about to make would not just be about her heart, but about the lives of three people linked by a thin thread of appearances and expectations. The rapprochement between Emily and Ethan became inevitable. At first, they were casual encounters, disguised as coincidences or social obligations. They met in discreet cafes or at charity events, always keeping up appearances, but exchanging looks full of hidden meanings. The tension between them was palpable, as if every word said was just an excuse for the real dialogue that took place in silence, through looks and gestures. Ethan, being bolder and less committed to social conventions, began looking for opportunities to be with Emily in a more intimate way. He invited her to lunches in distant places, where no one would recognize them, or to walks in quiet parks, where they could talk without being interrupted. Emily, although hesitant, found in these moments an escape from the suffocating reality she lived. Each encounter with Ethan made her question more of what she really wanted and, most importantly, who she really was. But it wasn't just the emotional tension that was growing, there was also a moral tension that Emily could no longer ignore. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, that one false step could destroy the life that Thomas, with all his effort, had built for them both. Yet each encounter with Ethan made her feel alive again, bringing to the surface feelings she believed were buried forever. Thomas, oblivious to the turmoil growing in his own home, began to notice small changes. Emily was more distant, more reserved. There was a coldness in her demeanor that he couldn't explain. She, who used to be the center of attention at any social event, now seemed to want to move away from those circles. And although he had noticed these changes, Thomas attributed it all to tiredness or stress that he believed she also shared due to the pace of life they led. Ethan, on the other hand, felt increasingly confident that the time to act was approaching. He saw the cracks in Emily and Thomas's marriage and knew he just needed one push to make it all fall apart. He was not a patient man, and every time he saw Emily return to Thomas's side, he felt a silent anger rise within him. He wanted to have her for himself, free from any commitment to Thomas, and he was willing to do whatever was necessary to make that happen. As winter settled in Chicago, bringing with it long nights and short days, the cold weather seemed to reflect Emily's emotional state. The feeling of being trapped between two lives consumed her, and she knew she couldn't go on like this much longer. Something needed to change, but the change that was coming would not be easy, nor painless. And it was on one of those freezing nights that everything started to fall apart. Thomas, arriving home earlier than expected, found the house silent. The lights were on, but there were no signs of Emily in the living room or kitchen. He walked up the stairs, feeling a pang of worry that he couldn't understand. When he opened the bedroom door, he found Emily sitting on the bed, holding a glass of wine, with an expression he had never seen before. She seemed to be on the verge of a revelation, but she controlled herself, avoiding his gaze. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Thomas, not knowing what to say, approached slowly, feeling that something was very wrong. Emily finally looked up, her eyes reflecting a deep sadness, mixed with something he couldn't decipher. And before he could ask what was going on, Emily's phone rang, interrupting that tense moment. She looked at the number on the screen and hesitated. Thomas, watching every movement, felt his stomach drop. Something was about to be revealed, and he instinctively knew that nothing would be the same as before. The call was like a silent bomb in the air. The seconds that Emily looked at her cell phone seemed like an eternity to Thomas. Every beat of his heart sped up, and a strange feeling that something was terribly wrong began to form in his chest. Not knowing how to react, he remained motionless, watching as she, with shaking hands, finally answered the call. "Hello." Emily's voice was weak, almost a whisper. Thomas strained to listen, but she quickly got up from the bed and left the room, heading towards the hallway, leaving him alone in the room, where every detail now seemed to carry immense weight. The curtains fluttered softly in the cold wind that came in through the half-open window, and the glass of wine that Emily had been holding minutes before was abandoned on the bedside table, a small puddle of red wine forming beside it. Thomas fought the confusion that dominated his thoughts. He was always a logical man, who sought rational answers to everything, but now, alone in that room, logic seemed distant, irrelevant. Something deeper, more visceral, was beginning to take over him. A silent suspicion, an uncomfortable idea that he didn't want to admit, but that became impossible to ignore. Deciding not to remain in the dark, Thomas followed Emily into the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floor. He found her in the living room, her back to him, speaking softly on the phone. Trying to maintain his composure, he approached slowly, enough to hear fragments of the conversation. "I know, yes, I'll talk to him, no, we can't go on like this." Each word landed like a blow. It was clear that the conversation was not trivial, and even more so, that it was not something she wanted him to hear. When Emily turned and found Thomas standing in the doorway of the room, her face tightened in surprise and something else he couldn't identify. Quickly hanging up the phone, she forced a smile, but the tension was palpable. "Who was it?" Thomas's voice came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't help it. The feeling of betrayal was growing, even though he still didn't know what exactly was happening. "She was just a friend. I needed advice." The lie came out quickly, but not with the conviction Emily expected. Thomas noticed the hesitation in her words and it only increased his distrust. "What kind of advice can't you ask me?" The question was direct, almost a challenge. He knew something was wrong, and he wasn't about to let it go. Emily looked down, as if trying to muster the courage to respond. She knew she had reached a point where she could no longer hide the truth, but revealing everything now, all at once, seemed impossible. She struggled internally, trying to find the right words, but feeling increasingly lost. "Thomas, we need to talk," she finally said, her voice cracking slightly. He nodded, his heart hammering in his chest as he prepared himself for what came next. They sat on the sofa, and for a few moments, the silence between them was absolute. "I don't know how to start," Emily mumbled, looking down at her hands. Thomas continued to watch her closely, feeling like the floor was about to collapse beneath his feet. "Then start at the beginning," he suggested, trying to remain calm but unable to shake the feeling that nothing she said could prepare him for what was to come. Emily took a deep breath, as if she needed the strength to speak. "Thomas, when we got married, I wanted to believe we were building something real. I tried hard to be the wife you deserved, to support you in everything. But I could never be honest, not with myself, not like you." Thomas frowned, trying to understand what she was getting at. "What do you mean by that, Emily?" She lifted her eyes to meet his, and the pain she saw there almost made her crumble. "I never loved you the way you believed. I tried, but there was someone else, there has always been someone else, since before we were married." The words hit Thomas like a shock wave. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Emily's revelation transformed everything in her mind, making the pieces of the puzzle finally fit together in a painful way. Every moment of coldness, every separation, now made sense. And then, anger began to emerge, mixed with pain and disbelief. "You never loved me. Then why did you marry me?" The question came out almost like a roar, a reflection of the storm brewing inside him. Emily closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening to fall. "I was pressured, Thomas. My family, there was too much at stake, and I had no choice. They forced me into this, and I didn't know what to do. You were safe. They thought it would be best for everyone but me. Better for everyone." He laughed, a bitter, incredulous laugh. "What now? You've stayed with me all this time just out of convenience. While you were with someone else." Emily shook her head, desperate to make him understand. "I tried, Thomas, I swear I tried to make it work. But the past, what I felt for him never went away. I thought I could forget it, but I couldn't." Thomas stood up from the couch, unable to remain still, anger now boiling inside him. "And this other one, who is he? Since when has this been happening?" Emily hesitated, but knew there was no point in hiding it any longer. "Ethan. He and I, we had something before I met you, but it was cut short when my family pushed me into marriage. And then when I met you again, it all came back. I know this is unforgivable, Thomas, but no, I can no longer live in this lie. Ethan's name made everything seem even more real, more cruel. That man, who he had always considered an acquaintance, someone he had never had any problems with, now revealed himself as the catalyst for all the suffering that was about to come crashing down on him. Thomas felt like he was in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from, and all he could do was try to find a way out, even if it was impossible. You're telling me that all this time, while I thought I had a life, a marriage, you were in love with another man? And this man? Ethan, he knew everything. Emily nodded, unable to speak. Thomas felt a rising heat of hatred that he had never felt before. He loved Emily, or at least, he loved the idea of who she was to him. But now, it all seemed like a sham, a construct that was quickly collapsing, revealing an abyss of pain and betrayal. I can't even look at you right now, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, before leaving the room, leaving Emily alone, feeling the crushing weight of the consequences of her choices. Thomas left the house as if the air inside was suffocating him, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts. Emily's revelation had lifted the ground from beneath his feet, and now he found himself adrift, not knowing what to do or where to go. He was always a practical man who solved problems efficiently, but now he was the problem. The Chicago cold cut into his skin as he walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to understand how his life had gotten to this point. Every step he took seemed to echo in his mind, reminding him of the painful truths he had just discovered. He thought about everything he had built, how much he dedicated himself to his marriage, and how everything seemed to have been a lie. The feeling of betrayal was overwhelming, and he couldn't imagine how he could continue living with this burden. Thomas had nowhere to go, no one to trust at that moment. Every friend he had was also Emily's friend, and he couldn't risk exposing his pain to those who might already know more than he did. There had always been a certain pride in Thomas, a belief that he could overcome any challenge, but now, that belief was in tatters. As he walked, an idea began to take shape in his mind. He was not the type of man who accepted defeat easily. If there was something he could do, he would do it. He needed to confront Ethan, needed to see with his own eyes the man who had stolen his life without him realizing it. He needed to understand why all this happened, even if the answers destroyed him even more. Determining what he would do, Thomas headed to Ethan's office. He knew that, at this time, he would be there, probably involved in some important case. Ethan was a busy man, someone who always had something to do, and that made everything even harder to bear. How could he be so blind as to not see what was happening right under his nose? Upon arriving at the building, Thomas quickly entered, ignoring the receptionist's attempts to stop him. He knew where Ethan's office was, and he didn't have time to waste on formalities. When he reached the door, he didn't hesitate to open it forcefully, entering the room without even knocking. Ethan was sitting behind his desk, focused on some papers, but when he saw Thomas, he looked up in surprise. "Thomas? What are you doing here?" Ethan's voice was calm, but Thomas felt like it was all just a facade. He walked over to the table, looking straight into Ethan's eyes. "I know about you and Emily." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He placed the papers down carefully, standing up to face Thomas head-on. There was a tension in the air, something thick and palpable. "I knew this moment would come," Ethan finally said, his voice low but firm. Thomas clenched his fists, fighting the urge to punch Ethan right then and there. "How could you do that? How could you get involved with her knowing she was my wife? What kind of man does that?" Ethan took a deep breath, keeping calm, but knowing that any misplaced word could trigger an explosion. "Thomas, this didn't start out as an intentional thing. When Emily and I got back together, there were old feelings that were never resolved. I'm not justifying what we did, but things got complicated." "Complicated?" Thomas repeated in disbelief. "You destroyed my marriage, my life, and you tell me things got complicated?" You knew what you were doing from the beginning. Ethan shook his head, trying to find a way to explain the unexplainable. I didn't look for this, Thomas. I never wanted to hurt you, but I also couldn't ignore how I felt about Emily. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I want you to understand that this was beyond anything I could have done. Control. Thomas took a step back, Ethan's words ringing hollow in his ears. How could he understand something like that? How could he forgive such a profound betrayal? All he knew was that the man in front of him had taken advantage of his trust, had invaded his life and taken the only thing he believed to be safe. I trusted you, Thomas said, his voice cracking slightly. I never saw it coming, and you just moved on, like none of it mattered. Like I didn't matter. Ethan was silent for a moment, aware that any defense he offered would be futile. He knew there were no words that could repair the damage he had caused. I know this doesn't help right now, but I'm so sorry, Thomas. I really am. But to Thomas, Ethan's apology sounded superficial. There was no going back, there was no erasing what had been done. He looked at Ethan one last time, seeing there a man who, no matter how hard he tried to justify himself, had ruined his life. You have no idea what you did, Thomas whispered, his voice filled with a sadness that seemed to come from a deep, dark place. He turned and left the office, without looking back. As he left the building, he felt like he was leaving a part of his life that would never be the same. Everything was changed. The pain of betrayal still pierced him like a sharp knife, but now, there was a new resolve. He knew he couldn't just move on as if nothing had happened. Something needed to be done, something that would mark this betrayal in a way that no one would forget. And as he walked the streets of Chicago, the cold night enveloping him, the darkness within him grew, ready to consume everything in its path. Thomas left Ethan's building with an empty feeling, as if everything he knew had been brutally ripped from his hands. The pain of betrayal still pulsed inside him, but there was something more, something he couldn't ignore, the need to do something, to make a decision that would change the course of his life. He couldn't just go home and pretend nothing had happened. That wasn't an option. As he walked through the cold streets of Chicago, Thomas's thoughts spiraled, and he found himself confronted with a moral dilemma he never imagined he would face. Emily and Ethan's betrayal had broken something inside him, and now he needed to decide what he would do with the remaining pieces. In his mind, the desire for revenge competed with the desire to simply disappear, to leave everything behind and start over somewhere else. But the reality was that he couldn't run away, couldn't erase the last years of his life. Upon arriving at a nearby park, Thomas sat on one of the benches, observing the emptiness in front of him. The darkness of the night reflected the darkness he felt within himself. He began to think about everything he had built, how he dedicated his life to a marriage that now seemed like a cruel joke. The happy memories were tainted by the recent discovery, and he wondered if there had ever been truth to his relationship with Emily. He also thought about Ethan, about how he had been deceived by someone he considered an acquaintance, a man who moved in the same circles, who was accepted and even admired. And now, this same man had revealed himself as the thief of her happiness. Thomas felt that, in some ways, he had been a fool, blinded by confidence and routine. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't have predicted something so insidious. As the night's chill intensified, Thomas found himself struggling with the options before him. He could confront Emily one last time, demand clearer answers, or even a full confession. But for what? What would he gain from this? More pain, more lies, more of the same vicious cycle that was destroying her sanity. Another option was divorce. A clean separation, where he would cut all ties with Emily, eliminating her from his life permanently. He knew this was a logical, practical solution. But what would you do afterwards? The idea of starting over alone, rebuilding everything from scratch, was scary. More than that, it was heartbreaking. He had invested so much time, so much effort into that relationship, that the idea of giving up now seemed almost like a defeat. And then there was revenge. A dark part of his mind whispered that he couldn't leave things like this, that he needed to retaliate somehow. Perhaps ruining Ethan's reputation, exposing the truth to everyone, or even taking more drastic measures against both of them. But revenge also brought with it unpredictable consequences, which could only perpetuate the cycle of pain and destruction. Thomas felt like he was on the edge of a precipice, where any choice he made would lead him down a path of no return. He could no longer be the man he was before, but he also didn't know what kind of man he would become from now on. The pressure of making a decision was overwhelming him, and he wondered if there was any way out that wouldn't result in even more suffering. As he lay there, deep in thought, an idea began to form, something that could finally give him a sense of control over the situation. He stood up, determined to act, no longer as the victim of betrayal, but as someone who would take control of his own destiny. Whatever he did next, it would have to be something that closed that chapter once and for all, something that made it clear that he was not a man who could be trampled on without consequences. Thomas knew that the actions he would take in the coming days would shape the rest of his life. There would be no going back, no second chances. And as he prepared to face what came next, the only thing he knew for sure was that he wouldn't let betrayal destroy him completely. The moral dilemma was placed before him: follow a path of revenge and pain, or try to find a way to start over, even if it meant carrying deep scars for the rest of his life. What would he do? What decision would you make? One thing was certain: nothing would be the same again. Thomas returned home with grim determination. There was no longer any doubt in his mind about what needed to be done. The decision he made that cold night in Chicago wasn't the easiest, but it was the only one he believed could give him some kind of closure. What he would do would not bring back the lost trust, nor erase the scars of betrayal, but it would put an end to a story that had already stretched beyond what was bearable. When he entered the house, Emily was in the living room, staring at the fire in the fireplace with a blank expression. She looked like she had aged years since the last time they really faced each other. Thomas watched her for a moment, reflecting on everything they had been through together. There was a time when he would have done anything for her, but now, everything seemed distant, as if it belonged to another life. "Emily," he called, his voice firm but not hostile. She looked up, and for an instant, he saw the shadow of the woman he once loved. But that was no longer enough to erase the pain he felt. "Thomas," she replied, voice shaking, knowing something was about to happen but not sure what. I'm sorry about everything." He nodded, but there was no forgiveness in his gaze. "I know you feel it. But what has been done cannot be undone." He stepped forward, handing her an envelope. "Here's everything you need to move forward. A divorce settlement. It's fair, and I don't want anything more from you than a signature." Emily stared at the envelope as if it were a death sentence, her hands shaking as she took it. She knew this moment would come, but the reality was more bitter than she ever imagined. "Thomas, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing more to say," he replied, with frightening calm. "I've already made my decision, and I think you need to make yours too." She opened the envelope and saw the divorce papers, accompanied by a substantial amount of money. It was enough to ensure she could start a new life, away from Chicago, away from everything that had kept them trapped for so long. But at the same time, it was the final confirmation that everything between them was over. Thomas waited while she processed everything. There was no longer anger in his heart, only a kind of resignation. He knew this was the only possible outcome, and he was surprised to find that the pain he had felt before began to dissipate, replaced by a cold but necessary acceptance. "I'll sign," Emily said finally, her voice breaking. "But you need to know that, Ethan and we don't have anything anymore. I broke up with him. I can't go through with this." Thomas just nodded. "It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that we can all move forward." Emily signed the papers with shaking hands, handing them back to Thomas. He took them, feeling the weight of what had just happened. That was the end of everything they had built, and at the same time, the beginning of something completely new, even if he didn't yet know what it would be. "I'm leaving the house tomorrow," Emily murmured, still trying to process what would happen next. "I'm going away, like you suggested." Thomas just nodded, without saying anything else. He turned and started up the stairs, leaving Emily alone in the living room, staring at the fire in the fireplace. Upstairs, in the room they once shared, he felt a strange peace come over him. It was as if, by finally confronting reality, he had managed to free himself from the weight he was carrying. The next morning, Emily left without saying anything else. Thomas watched from afar as she got into the car and disappeared down the road, taking with her the memories of a life he no longer wanted to remember. He knew that, somewhere, Ethan was also dealing with the consequences of his choices, but that no longer mattered to him. Thomas was alone in that big house, but loneliness no longer scared him. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that he would have to find a new purpose, a new reason to keep going. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could do this. "I could start over." And so, as the city of Chicago woke up to another cold day, Thomas prepared to leave behind the past that had haunted him. He knew the scars would always be there, but now, they were just marks of a battle he had decided to win, not by force, but by the choice to move forward. The end of that story was not a fairy tale, but it was the necessary closure so that everyone involved could find their own ways to move forward. For Thomas, it was the beginning of a new journey, still unknown, but finally free from the weight of betrayal.